Hi, Goth Girls. This is Strange, coming at you live from the Dufferin Mall Pocket Dimension. Can you smell the Cinnabon? Well, I'm out here today because I've heard that Mall Goth is back. And I've been seeing all these TikTok kids, and they got all these piercings, and the split-dyed hair, and they're wearing the bondage pants, and the safety pin shirts, and all these chunky chokers. The studded belts have returned to Hot Topic. There's no Hot Topic here, but I don't feel like getting chased by Eaton Center security. Kids these days are telling me that Mall Goth is back. Do you think they can even name 5 Bauhaus songs? I wish I could feel joy. They're calling themselves Mall Goth, punk, emo, scene. Do they even know what any of these things mean? All these subcultures of the past are being ripped out of their graves and just commercialized to shit as fodder for the social media trend cycle garbage, the aesthetics or whatever. You know, kids these days, they want to be mall goths now. And when I look within myself, so does my washed up 24-year-old ass in the flat field. All we ever wanted was everything. Crowds, slice of life. Bela Lugosi's dead, obviously. You know, there's a decent argument to be made that we can never be mall goths. Mall goths. I know you don't hang around at the mall with your friends on Sundays and hiss at people who you see entering the Hollister. And I'm gonna be really open with you right now. Neither do I. You can wear your spiked bracelets and your trip pants, but kids don't really hang out in malls anymore. There is no longer a cultural context to be a mall goth. It's something that arose out of the very specific conditions of the 90s, and you can't just transplant the fashion into the 2020s and expect to find any meaning in it. But maybe that's too cynical. Maybe, Strange, you should just calm down, let people enjoy things. Where are we? What is going on? Maybe you should just let people like things and stop promoting trad goth elitism. I've been to an internet hole this week, and I have crawled out of it, and I've dragged myself to the Dufferin Mall, and I'm gonna try and tell you the true meaning of Christmas. Mall Goth. Cut to HelloFresh sponsorship. This video is sponsored by HelloFresh. They make it fast, easy, and affordable to get quality, healthy meals in your home. Ingredients travel from the farm to your kitchen in less than 7 days, so you know that everything is fresh. Kristen and I actually learned how to cook during the pandemic when we had a lot of free time, and we cooked a lot. We thought we would never in our lives use something as silly as a meal kit service, because we were just so good at cooking. Life happens, life gets busy. We ended up trying it for the first time a few months ago, unsponsored, and it was really nice. And if you too, dear viewer, are in the funk of eating cereal for dinner every night, bored of your usual cooking staples, it's a great way to spice things up, get re-inspired about cooking, feel a little bit more human and functional. I love ratatouille. They're great for busy weeknights. The 2 meals that I got only take 30 minutes to prepare, and I know some of them are as quick as 15. They have over 35 weekly recipes, and you can customize them to fit your personal preferences, swap out proteins and sides. Usually when I feel like trying something new, I end up getting takeout, and this is a way healthier and more affordable option. Today I tried the roasted salmon. It was easy and super quick to make, and I was surprised by how filling it was. It was tasty and it was very filling. So make sure you go to HelloFresh.com and use code STRANGEYONS21 to get 21 free meals as well as free shipping. That is a whole 21 free meals and free shipping when you go to HelloFresh.com and use code STRANGEYONS21. Mall goths. Mall goths.
Who can play at that game?
So what is mall goth? That's an interesting question because mall goth was arguably never a real subculture. I don't know if anybody ever really thought of themselves as a mall goth. I mean, probably some did, but pretty much everyone just called themselves goth. Goth had been around since the late 70s. And, you know, times change, subcultures evolve to reflect their times. So the term mall goth was coined in the 90s to describe the younger generation of goths that came of age around that time. It was originally a derogatory term, like an insult against those younger goths, bemoaning the commercialization of goth fashion. Mall goths, they wore the fashion, but it was perceived as being in an inauthentic way. They didn't really listen to goth music or understand goth music or where the subculture had come from. Posers.
They were posers.
Yes. Mall goth was very much synonymous with like posers or wannabe goths. They bought their clothes at the mall instead of ripping them themselves. What the fuck is this Hot Topic place you speak of? They're selling what there? Mall goth referred first not to teens hanging out in malls, as I had thought, but to the commercialization of goth fashion and the inauthenticity of 90s goths in the eyes of older goths. The definition has, of course, also been expanded to refer to a certain particular type of goth kids who were known to hang out in malls and be obnoxious in public.
I wouldn't have probably liked being called a mall goth. I'm only okay with it because I worked at Hot Topic. Most of the people that were extreme looking or goth were kind of assholes to people. Like, whenever someone approached them, they would, snarl or hiss and do crazy shit like that.
But if we really want to understand the condition of, I can see you eating fries in the corner of the frame right now. If we really want to understand the 90s mall goth condition, we first must look back even further to how goth originated.
It's all based on something which is a little bit real. I mean, it's the people that make the atmosphere. It's not suck your cheeks in and pose in the corner. It's very friendly, and it's basically about fun, and it's about having your tongue firmly in your cheek, and being able to laugh at the realities of the day-to-day.
Like I said, goth goes all the way back to the late 70s. It was first and foremost a subculture formed around a shared love of goth music. As the popularity of the music genre grew, goth nights at clubs were established, even whole clubs dedicated to the gothic genre, which drew in the creatures of the night who wanted to dress creatively and socialize and go wild and, probably do a lot of cocaine because it was the 80s. Clubs were the predominant setting where goths spent their time with other goths, where the subculture was born and developed for decades. The clubs were where it was at. That's where people went to dance and to experience the music. It was all about the music. As for that music itself, gothic music tends to center very dark, romantic themes. It's very broody, morbid, sometimes nihilistic. Aesthetically, it draws from gothic literature. There's this amazing video, which I will link below, called Before Bauhaus, How Goth Became Goth. It really documents the development of goth as a music genre. TLDR though, the term gothic rock was coined in the 1960s to describe the song The End by The Doors. The Doors are not a goth band though. The emergence of whole goth albums, goth bands, and the whole subculture around it wasn't until the 80s. The release of Bauhaus' song Bela Lugosi's Dead in 1979 is considered a pretty big defining moment for goth as a music genre, because that song is like, yeah, that's goth. That's it. They nailed it right there. They defined it right there. That's the goth song. There are a few big, important, defining bands that you should know, which are Bauhaus, Susie and the Banshees, The Cure, Joy Division. A lot of these bands were otherwise or previously known as post-punk bands, so goth is seen as a genre which emerged from post-punk. Post-punk obviously emerged before that from punk, but while punk was a lot of yelling and screaming and breaking things, post-punk was seen as more refined, but punk's rebellious, anti-capitalist DIY spirit absolutely carries through all the way to goth. But if punk was more angry, goth was more kind of broody and sad and just enamored with the beauty of sadness and darkness. Goths would rather write a poem about their problems than fight someone about it, Goths are nerds, essentially. The original goth styles are what we would now call trad goth or traditional goth. The big teased up hair and the super pale foundation and the Susie and the Banshees eye makeup, the all black flowy clothing with lots of layers and textures. That's 80s goth, trad goth, but what we're really here to talk about is 90s goth. How's the black lipstick holding up?
A little dicey, but not bad.
Okay. Behold my bounty. I hope you can't hear me chewing tapioca disgustingly. ASMR, mall goth ASMR. I just sample all of the food court food. Someone's into it. I hate chewing noises, but I know people are into it. It's important to note that not all 90s goths were mall goths. That in itself was a big point of contention between the two groups, because they all called themselves the same thing and they all kind of looked the same. Nobody called themselves mall goth. It was very much an insult. They all called themselves goths. But the goths who tended to hang around in malls had very different values and very different music tastes than other goths. A very common synonym for mall goths was spooky kids, because they were Marilyn Manson fans. Marilyn Manson fans were called spooky kids. If you're familiar with Marilyn Manson, then that alone should give you an idea of how mall goths were so different, because he was so about shock value and extravagant performance, rebelling in every possible way against conformist American society, just being as disgusting and contrary as possible. Sex and violence and gender fuckery, and I'm the Antichrist and I love abortion. Fuck you, Christian church, I'm in public. I'm the Antichrist and I love abortion. Fuck you, Christian church moms. I'm sorry. Everything that was taboo. See, okay, I guess I am feeling a little bit of the mall goth thrill of being obnoxious in public.
And I was wearing this old Marilyn Manson tee that I got at Hot Topic in like 96 or something. And it had an American flag on it, but with the Shock logo in the top. And then on the back, in patriotic red, white, and blue, it said, American by birth, Antichrist by choice. Which I wasn't actually Antichrist. I just got a kick out of pushing people's buttons.
Other music that was considered very mall goth, bands like Nine Inch Nails, Evanescence, Korn, Slipknot, Rob Zombie. There were all these new, weird, sad, angry bands, and people were calling them goth, even though they were very much not gothic rock. It was these teens. They were calling these bands goth that weren't goth. They were wearing these vampire corsets from Hot Topic, and that's not real goth. Some people got their fishnets seriously twisted about it. That being said, a lot of goths, they liked gothic rock and this new music and new metal, and like it wasn't a big deal. The people who were really purists about it were always kind of considered assholes.
I've never been sneered at ever in like 13 years on the goth scene for liking bands that aren't goth occasionally and etc etc. And if you are being kind of tormented and sneered at by some like elitist cunt, so you know, in your life, then why are you seeking to ingratiate yourself to someone who's being a bitch?
So definitely some of the animosity between mall goths and other goths was just kind of slap fighting about who was really goth, and a generational difference between them a lot of the time, of course. But that's like obviously gonna happen, because for me, as someone born in 1998, I can never be goth the way that somebody in my age in 1985 was goth, because the world which I exist in changes my experience of it so much. And equally, somebody who was goth in 1995 could not be goth in the same way as someone from 1985. There was all this new fashion and music and technology that shaped them into something completely different. Sorry, the mic was in my pocket. Mall goth. This is the closest we're gonna get to Hot Topic, huh? Mall goth. They can't hear you. Mall goth. This is a Christian establishment. Two really big fashion icons of mall goth were, like I said, Marilyn Manson, as well as Amy Lee, the lead singer of Evanescence. Mall goths could often be identified, discerned out from other goths based on them, their Marilyn Manson-y styles, the way that they copied him, the different colored contact lenses, those white contact lenses, other hallmarks like that. They could, of course, also be identified by their clothes from Hot Topic. Other goths were kind of ashamed to shop there, but apparently still sometimes did. Oh, you want to do the heart thing? Baggy shirts with baggy pants was one of the most common looks for guys, although it could be androgynous as well. Mall goths, though, they still had most things in common with the overall goth subculture. Some things that were very popular with 90s goth in general were those bondage pants, sometimes called Trip pants, after the most popular brand that made them, Trip NYC. Of course, they were carried at Hot Topic. Studded belts, bracelets, and chokers, platform shoes, fishnets, all of them. Put them on your arms, put them on your legs. Striped tights, corsets, lots of piercings, crosses and Egyptian Ankh symbols were both very popular. A lot of goths, as the 2000s progressed, started using MySpace. Alternative communities like that were some of the first to adopt the potentials of internet community. There's also a decent overlap between goths and like nerd culture and gaming culture. Weirdos are weirdos, and that's still true. I mean, do you know any alternative people who don't also watch anime or play video games or read 800-page fantasy novels or collect figurines? No, because it's just true. It's just a fact of the world. Thank you, Mall Goth Tia. That's actually a pretty good transition into what I want to talk about next, which is the social aspect of being goth in the 90s. What it boils down to really is that alternative people were just bullied relentlessly as teenagers in high school and as adults.
The stark contrast of their pale faces and dreary clothes bring a lot of unwanted glares from strangers.
I don't like a negative attention from people, but after a while I just start to block it out, because I got it every day at school.
The bullies at school used to call me the Grim Reaper. I never ever smiled.
You were persecuted for it. You were yelled obscenities at. You were told you're going to hell. And when I started, like, you know, going to school like this in the 90s, I scared the hell out of people. When I walked down the hallway, like, all the people would just part out of my way.
We had something called Beat the Freak Week. And it was basically exactly the way it sounds. It was anybody that was of the alternative genre were basically subject to violent assaults. This was not pushing, this was not shoving, this was not bullying. There were people getting airlifted to hospitals. Teachers, faculty, they had no idea how to handle the situation. And there was actually a point, I believe like 3 or 4 days in, where they rounded up all of the alternative kids and they got us all into the auditorium and locked us in. There were people banging on the doors, trying to get in from the outside to get at us. And it was the most bizarre thing I'd ever experienced. They didn't discriminate whether you were male or female. There were males that were just basically going after and attacking female students. There were guys that were actually masturbating into cups and then throwing it into the face of girls who they considered freaks.
Nobody really resonates deeply with goth music and starts dressing goth because they're having a great time socially and mentally. I think the fashion, the aesthetic aspect of it is so important because of this desire to externalize your weirdness. As a teenager, I always felt like if I looked plain and unassuming, then the things that were wrong with me would stand out more in contrast with the normalcy. But if I wore dark eyeliner and straightened my hair and wore as much jewelry as my school uniform would permit, then people would see that first and go, well, of course she's a little bit quirky. It's not undiagnosed mental and physical illnesses and violently repressed homosexuality. She's just kind of emo, and I think we kind of understand what emo is. I very much wanted to be in control of the reasons why I was a freak. I totally get why it was so important to people to dress goth, even though it made their lives very difficult socially in a lot of other ways. In 1996, the movie The Craft was released, and it was one of the first mainstream portrayals of a goth character. It gave goths, especially goth girls, an association with the occult, with witchcraft.
You girls watch out for those weirdos.
We are the weirdos, mister.
If you're not a goth, you look at me, you look at Nancy, and you don't see much differences, but what you do see is a ton of similarities, and you see basically the same person. And that is what everyone else saw when they looked at me, and that made a high school a very interesting experience. Goths really met with a mixed opinion all around because, on one sense, we were really hypersexualized now because a lot of the guys saw it as something different, something dangerous, and we were perved on in not the most gentlemanly manners. And there was also the fact that a lot of people looked at us with awe. They thought that we were witches.
And that definitely made some more conservative people just extra afraid of them. But it also gave them some little bit of social power to use that fear and that intrigue. That like scary witchy girl stereotype. It was a stereotype and it was annoying, but it was also useful to people in a lot of ways.
I remember threatening kids at school that I was going to curse them and stuff. You know, the kind of cringy thing you do when you're a teenager and you're bullied and suddenly the culture of the time you're in has given you this dark power. The only way you can think to fight back is to try and creep people out.
In 1999, something else happened which defined goths in the mainstream and really, really shook the goth community to its core and created a further rift between goths and mall goths. You might be clenching already if you know even a little bit of goth history, because I'm talking about the Columbine shooting. The narrative around Columbine for a long time was this highly sensationalized story that the two shooters were goths who called themselves the Trenchcoat Mafia. Trenchcoats were very common goth fashion, that they were Marilyn Manson fans and his violent music inspired them to do it as revenge for the bullying that they'd suffered.
The clues were here in Littleton long before the deadly violence. The yearbook pictures with handwritten captions about insanity. This alleged Trenchcoat Mafia website shut down shortly after ABC News took these pictures.
They wear trench coats every day to school, and wear makeup and paint their nails and stuff. They're just I don't know, everyone kind of thinks of them as different.
It later came out that the shooters had no connection to the goth community, didn't even like Marilyn Manson, but that narrative was a very powerful one for a very long time because it just fit so well with the general panics of the time. It was sort of a spillover, a continuation of the whole satanic panic of the 80s. You know, goths are Satanists and witches and murderers, and there was just so much outrage and fear after Columbine, and a lot of scrutiny fell on the goth community, and especially goth teenagers in school.
I remember the weekend after the Columbine shootings, there were news outlets at the goth clubs.
And if you were a young goth at high school, they genuinely suspected you of being a potential terrorist.
They'd been people's obvious targets for harassment for so many years, and suddenly everybody looked at them differently and went, Oh.
All the way through high school, I had been picked on every fucking day. It was complete misery. It was bloody awful. But when I started dressing goth, the bullies actually backed off. Now, I don't know whether part of that was me just having more self-confidence and obviously not giving a fuck. But I do think Columbine also had something to do with this too.
People who had been predatory towards them were suddenly afraid of them. But that wasn't, you know, ideal either. A lot of people still stopped being goth during this time because, you know, you don't want to be harassed, but you also don't want to be seen as a potential murderer all the time. Many goths made an effort to speak up, to present themselves as just normal people living their lives and expressing themselves, whereas other goths, typically teenage mall goth types, really leaned into this ability to scare people. To me, it sounds like, from all of this research that I've done, that the post-Columbine era was when the divide between goths and mall goths was really solidified. Goths were nerdy and introspective and artistic, and mall goths were these kind of publicly obnoxious Marilyn Manson fan types.
These days it's become like, oh my god, mall goth stylistics, you're so 90s chic and all of this. Back then, mall goths were a dirty word because they weren't goths. They were spooky kids. They would do things like hang out in big gangs in a mall, all wearing trench coats. They would have vampire fangs in. They would often carry knives, like, you know, the really swirly, fancy-looking knives. If anyone walked too close, they would bare their fangs at them and go at the people walking past. You know, really cringy stuff like this. Or they'd be sitting in diners and they'd start biting into each other's necks and pretending to feed on each other, or they'd start talking loudly about Satanism. They'd start pretending to do satanic rituals in the middle of the dining hall in the mall. Like, I shit you not.
You may have seen the foreshadowing already, but yes, mall goth was very much a predecessor to emo. My childhood. We all know our girl Ebony. She's an amazing example of that weird transition period between goth and emo in the early 2000s. My Immortal was written in 2006. By then, emo was quite established as a genre. It was capturing the hearts of little freaks everywhere. Emo, you will never guess, started out as an insult, as a derogatory term, and so nobody really called themselves emo. Where does that sound familiar from? It's almost as if people in alternative subcultures are just constantly suspicious of change, and like everything will always find a reason for new things to be worse and less authentic than what came before. Once again, you see everything still being compared back to the purity of trad goth. 80s gothic rock is great, and trad goth fashion is great, but it would be unnatural to hold ourselves to only that when the world keeps moving forward.
To stick tightly to that trad goth 80s stereotype now is just squeezing yourself into a stereotype and essentially conforming. To my mind, at the heart of goth is originality and freedom of expression and creativity.
The evolution of alternative culture and style is good, and with that in mind, should we really be so cynical about this 2020s mall goth revival? Well, okay, there is absolutely a trend towards things becoming solely fashion-oriented rather than based around subcultures and communities and music. And these days, I think there are parts of the fashion industry that are just like straight up cartoon villain evil, and I do not like to support fast fashion very often. The irony, just oh my god, the irony of the label mall goth being revived to sell us shallow 90s nostalgia when you think about how the label originated. The spirit of these subcultures is DIY, is anti-capitalism. I do think there is something fundamentally un-goth about buying goth clothes on Shein. I think our punk ancestors would kick our asses for that shit. That being said, I am not turning this into a purity contest in an all-new way. I am not doing that. I think there are lots of commercially available items now that are extremely cool, and it's okay to spend on them responsibly so long as they're good enough quality not to disintegrate after 2 washes or anything like that. I don't have the ability to only thrift and make all of my clothing either. And I like seeing kids wearing emo stuff that I thought was really cool as a kid. The speed of the trend cycle alarms me. I did not expect to be saying that at only 24 years old. But you know, it may not be as much of a lifestyle as it was back in the 80s and the 90s, but fashion is still fun. And you know what? I dare say, maybe it's better now that we have the ability to experiment with fashion rather than being screamed at on the street for looking different. If you like goth fashion, mall goth fashion, emo fashion, whatever it is, and you don't listen to any of the music, try it out. And if you don't like it, that's also fine. You know what we call forcing yourself to like something that you don't actually like? It's being a poser. Nobody is ever going to fit perfectly into one aesthetic, one subculture. Who cares about having a perfect, cohesive, marketable aesthetic? That's the social media demons talking. Wear weird shit, have bad taste, heal your inner bullied child through whatever means necessary. That's what it's fucking about, dude. That's it. That's the video. Strange out. Mall Goth!